You guys ready to take a time travel back into the past? Now that we're done talking about the piece of shit that is Joker 2, we can move on to something good? Yeah, me too. And today we are time traveling back to the 50s. Yes, the 1950s, where B-movies and monster mashes reigned supreme. But back then, there weren't really much horror movies, per se. A lot of it was, B-movie, cheesy monster movies. Not really horror, more like sci-fi. But that all changed when a little company known as Hammer, from Britain, I believe they are a Britain company, decided to remake all of the original classic Universal monsters. Well, not all of them, but some of them, particularly Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy. And while Dracula is probably their most well-known and longest-running series, I already talked about that one in VampFest, so I can't really go over it much here. And as for the Mummy series, I think we're going to save that for another time, because I have a different series planned for that. So, that leaves us with the Frankenstein series, and strangely enough, whereas with the Universal monster movies it started with Dracula and then Frankenstein, here it's the opposite. It starts with Frankenstein and then Dracula came out not long after. So this is, in particular, the first Hammer horror remake. And it is a damn good one. This has been highly regarded as one of, if not the greatest horror movie remake of all time. And while I can't agree, because I am a gore hound and I do have a soft spot for that kind of stuff, I can definitely say that this is a fantastic movie that definitely belongs in the conversation of best remakes ever. Because this is how all remakes should be done. You take elements and maybe a basic template from the classic original, but you add on your own flair. You add on your own story. You add on your own plots. You add on your own touch on it. And not to the point of just itty-bitty little originality here and there. Nightmare 2010. No. What I'm talking about is a movie that barely takes anything from its original variation and instead making its own entire separate thing, just using the same name. And that's pretty much what we have here. It is a remake, but you would definitely be surprised to learn that it is a remake, considering how it is almost nothing like the original 1931 movie, at all. It is its very own separate thing, and Hammer really tried their damnness to make this one different from the original. Which, it kind of makes sense, because they were scared to death of Universal trying to sue them, which is also why we don't have the classic Jack Kirby... Sorry, not Jack Kirby, what the fuck was his name? You know what I mean. The classic look from the Universal monster movies. I forget his name, editing, correct me later. So, going into this one, I was already pretty excited, because I was introduced to this series through Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. That's how I first heard about it. In his little 31 History of Horror, his very first Monster Madness from 2006, I believe? It was 2006, if I'm not mistaken. 2006. And it has become a tradition for me to watch Monster Madness ever since, but I've never really gotten into watching most of these movies. I did, however, I did watch the Dracula movies last year leading up to Renfield, so I have seen some of this company's movies, but I have not seen all of them, which is why I'm diving into the Frankenstein series next. So, without further ado or delay, let's dive into it. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it, because my written review pretty much sums it all up pretty well. It's a pretty detailed review, but as always, no spoilers. That way, if you do want to watch this movie for yourself, you're still surprised on your first watch. So, without further ado, let's dive into The Curse of Frankenstein. Here's my written review. I hope you enjoy. This right here is how remakes should be done. Starting in the 50s and running all the way through the 70s, a company known as Hammer decided to remake the classic Universal monsters for a newer generation, adding color and a lot of blood. Like, these movies do not skimp out on the blood. It is tame by today's standards, where Terrifier reigns supreme, but back then, it was really pushing the boundaries. And it all started right here with 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. And it's not hard to see why they made so many more after it, because this is a fantastic retelling of the tale, making stars out of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who later go on to play Van Helsing and Dracula respectively, not too long after this, as well as a dozen other well-known roles, spanning from the likes of Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow to even Star Wars. Pros: fantastic acting, especially Cushing, who actually managed to surpass Colin Clive. Because while it doesn't seem like he's going to surpass him at first, the more you watch the movie, the more you love his performance. Whereas with the original Universal Monster movies, Dr. Frankenstein, he was mad and crazy, but he was sympathetic, and you understood his pursuit for science. Here, this Frankenstein is an absolute monster, even more of a monster than the ones that he creates, because he is willing to do literally anything in pursuit for his science, especially not even holding back on killing people just to get the body parts needed for the experiment. Yeah, this is a more deranged, unsympathetic, horrifying Mad Doctor, and arguably one of the best in movie history. Now, is he better than Dr. Pretorius from the original Frankenstein series? That's to be debated, because Ernest Thesiger also put in an amazing performance as that character. But here, with this Frankenstein, it's so different from the original, and while it doesn't seem like he's going to surpass Clive at first, the more you watch it, the more you start to buy him as this character, and he actually manages to surpass Clive. Not to mention, he has more than 2 movies. I know that wasn't entirely Clive's fault, as he did pass away shortly after Bride of Frankenstein released at the young age of 31, but at the same time, that is something you have to make clear, because Cushing has 5 movies, whereas Colin Clive only had 2, you get more time with this character. You get to really know this character. And even with this movie, you get to see his origin story. You get to see how Paul grew him up on science, and how he taught him everything he knows, and how he realized inadvertently he was creating one of the worst monsters he could have created. And Frankenstein himself is just a bastard, and I mean that in the best way possible. So, yeah, Peter Cushing, amazing role, but I don't know whether or not if it's better than his role as Van Helsing in the Dracula movies. I think they're both kind of pick and choose. Great story that's drastically different from the original 1931 movie. Excellent set design, one of the coolest freaking mad scientist labs ever created on film, and yes, I will die on that hill. Some pretty good gore for the time period that's tame by today's standards, but for back then, it was pretty damn ballsy. Superb characters, no one here feels like a cliche, or no one feels like a complete throwaway. Even all the side characters are very well developed. Great slow burn pacing. This movie is slow, but it's not to the point of like agonizing slow. It's slow as in it takes its time and really lets it sink in the transformation from this young eager scientist to this adult raving psychopathic murderer. Solid runtime of less than 2 hours. This was before that became a thing. A great ending. I'm not going to say more about that because it is a great ending. And pretty high rewatchability. I have been trying to rewatch. I want to rewatch this series more. Like I said, I rewatched Monster Madness Marathon every single year, and this is included in that. And I believe it is in Sequel-a-thon where this is included in that. However, that doesn't mean this movie's perfect. Even though I do have lots of praise for it, I do have some cons for it. Firstly, is the creature's design is okay. I understand they had to do this to get around getting sued by Universal, but it's not really a memorable movie design, especially for the titular monster. But it's good enough. It does have some really good makeup effects, and Christopher Lee does a great job in the role, even though he doesn't get to do much, unfortunately. And even more unfortunately, this is the only time that he would play the monster. Kind of a bummer. And the second half of the movie is pretty cheesy B-movie fare. When the monster's actually unveiled and he goes out on the town, it is pretty cheesy. It's a pretty cheesy movie, just as you expect from the 50s. Overall, though, while it can't quite escape the cheesiness of its monster movie roots, as much as I love those movies, that is entirely undeniable. Those movies are very cheesy. It's an excellent character-driven, grisly tale of a deranged man's pursuit for science, and even all these decades later has aged really well. It's one of the best horror movie remakes of all time, and a great watch for spooky season. If you have not watched this movie for whatever reason, especially if you're a fan of the Frankenstein series, you need to check this one out. It is specifically, certainly, a must-watch. And because of that, final verdict for Curse of Frankenstein is a high 9 out of 10. A great remake. Definitely check it out if you, for whatever reason, have not yet already. So how will they continue this? Well, we'll find out next time when we dive into the next movie in the series, one that I actually managed to actually have a DVD copy of, and that is The Revenge of Frankenstein. So, yeah, see you for that review.